The house stood at the end of Holloway Lane, its sagging roof and shattered windows staring like empty eye sockets at anyone who dared pass. For decades, it had been abandoned, left to decay in silence. But silence was never truly silent in that place. There were whispers, soft and insidious, seeping from the walls like trapped souls pleading to be freed. No one in town dared approach it, except for David Carter. David had grown up hearing the stories. The missing children, the old woman who hanged herself in the attic, the family that disappeared without a trace. But David, now a college student majoring in folklore, didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in history, in legends spun from real tragedy, and he wanted to uncover the truth behind the house on Holloway Lane. One crisp autumn evening, he grabbed his flashlight, a voice recorder, and his notebook and made his way down the cracked pavement toward the house. The front yard was overgrown, weeds strangling the rusted fence, and the air smelled of damp rot. He stepped onto the porch, and the wood groaned under his weight. The door was slightly ajar, as if inviting him in. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mold and decay. Dust swirled in the dim light filtering through broken windows. The wallpaper had peeled away in long strips, exposing rotting wood beneath. But what caught David's attention was the staircase. Something about it seemed wrong. It was steep, too steep, and the angles were subtly off, as if the house had been built in defiance of natural laws. As he ascended, his breath hitched. The whispers began, so soft they could have been the wind, but they weren't. "Help us." He froze. The voice was right behind him. Spinning around, he saw only empty air. His heart pounded, but he forced himself to keep moving. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched into darkness. He took a tentative step forward when he heard the creak of a floorboard, then another. Someone was walking toward him. Swinging his flashlight in every direction, he found nothing. His fingers trembled as he pressed record on his voice recorder. "This is David Carter," he whispered. "I've just heard—" A bang interrupted him. A door at the end of the hall slammed shut. David swallowed hard, but moved toward it, each step more difficult than the last. He reached out and pushed the door open. The attic. Dust motes floated in the air, illuminated by his flashlight. A wooden chair sat in the middle of the room, a noose hanging above it. His stomach churned as he took in the sight. The whispers intensified, rising in urgency. "Leave." He turned to flee, but the door slammed shut behind him. The flashlight flickered, and suddenly he wasn't alone. A figure stood in the corner. A woman, her head cocked unnaturally to one side, her face obscured by tangled black hair. Her feet hovered inches above the ground. David couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then she rushed at him. The flashlight shattered as he stumbled backward, hitting the floor hard. The whispers became deafening, voices overlapping in frantic desperation. A cold hand grasped his wrist, and agony shot through him. He thrashed, kicking wildly, and suddenly the door burst open. The whispers stopped. Panting, he scrambled to his feet and ran. Down the stairs, through the front door, into the night. He didn't stop until he was back in town, gasping for air under the glow of streetlights. His wrist throbbed. Looking down, he saw dark bruises, finger marks where something had grabbed him. His voice recorder was still clutched in his other hand. With trembling fingers, he pressed play. Static. Then a single voice. "We told you not to come." I grew up on a quiet street in North Carolina, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody. But there was one house sitting alone at the very end of our narrow road that nobody wanted to know. It was a two-story relic of another time, its wooden siding weathered and gray, its windows dark even in the midday sun. The house felt alive in the worst possible way, watching, waiting. We all knew who lived there. Two men, Mr. Hollis and Mr. Grayson, had occupied the house for as long as anyone could remember. Mr. Grayson was the one we saw the most. He was the janitor at our school. Every morning he would be there, pushing his mop down the long halls, his eyes downcast, his expression unreadable. He never spoke more than a grunt, and if he caught you staring too long, he'd glare at you with such intensity that you'd quickly find somewhere else to look. Mr. Hollis, on the other hand, was rarely seen. Some said he never left the house at all. None of us kids dared go near that house. It wasn't just the way it looked, though it was the sort of place you imagined monsters lived. It was the feeling it gave you, like something just beyond your vision was reaching for you, something old and hungry. We'd see strange shadows moving behind the curtains, even when we knew Mr. Grayson was at work. At night, flickering candlelight would dance through the gaps in the boarded-up attic windows. And then there were the sounds, low murmurs, rhythmic chants that sent shivers down your spine if you were unfortunate enough to hear them on a quiet evening. The adults in the neighborhood didn't talk about the house much, or the men inside it. When we asked, they'd brush it off with a quick, mind your own business. But some nights, I'd hear my parents whispering about them. About the animals that went missing. About the foul-smelling smoke that sometimes billowed from the chimney, carrying a scent that made even the bravest among us gag. And about the one time, years before I was born, when a group of teenagers dared each other to break into the house. They never made it past the front porch. One of them, a boy named Tommy Renshaw, had gone up to the door, and the moment his fingers brushed the doorknob, he collapsed into a screaming fit, clawing at his own skin. They said he never spoke a word about what happened, that he was never quite right again. We knew to stay away. Years passed and the house remained as it was, silent, brooding, untouched by time, until one day it wasn't. Mr. Grayson was found dead in his own bed, alone. Mr. Hollis had already passed years before, his cause of death unknown, his body removed under the cover of night. No one had even realized Mr. Dwetty. Grayson had died until the smell reached the neighbors. When the authorities finally went inside, the entire neighborhood held its breath. The news spread quickly, faster than wildfire. It wasn't just an old man dying alone. It was what they found inside. The house was filled with things no sane person should have. Books bound in leather that wasn't quite right, filled with symbols that twisted and burned the eyes if you looked too long. Walls lined with jars containing things that shouldn't have been in jars. An altar in the basement, carved from stone so black it seemed to drink the light. And on that altar, dried blood, pools and streaks of it, too much to have come from one person alone. The authorities did their best to keep it quiet, but there was no stopping the stories. People who had stepped inside swore they heard whispers, even when they were alone. One officer claimed he felt hands brush against him in the empty hallways. Another quit the force entirely after that night, refusing to speak about what he'd seen in the attic. The house was condemned and torn down within a month. They said it was for safety reasons, but everyone knew better. The lot has remained empty ever since. No one will build there, no one will buy the land. Even now, decades later, people avoid walking past where it once stood. But sometimes on a quiet night, if you stand at the end of the road and listen closely, you can still hear the whispers. And if you wait long enough, you might even see the flickering glow of candlelight where no house should be. The darkness never really left. The quiet suburban neighborhood of Willow Lane was the kind of place where nothing ever happened. The streets were lined with perfectly manicured lawns, white picket fences, and houses that all looked eerily similar. Children played in the yards, and neighbors waved to each other from their porches. It was the epitome of normalcy, until the day the fire trucks came screaming down the street, their sirens shattering the peaceful silence. It was a Tuesday afternoon when it happened. Most of the neighborhood was at work or running errands, leaving the streets unusually empty. The only sound was the faint rustling of leaves in the autumn breeze. But then, the smell of smoke began to waft through the air, subtle at first, but growing stronger with each passing minute. By the time the first flames were visible, licking hungrily at the windows of the house at the end of the street, it was too late to stop what had already been set in motion. The house belonged to the Millers, a young couple who had moved in just a year earlier. Sarah Miller, a petite woman with long, dark hair and a warm smile, had been the picture of happiness when she first arrived. She was often seen pushing a stroller down the sidewalk, her newborn daughter Lily cooing softly as they went. Her husband, Mark, was a kind but reserved man who worked long hours as an accountant. To everyone on Willow Lane, they seemed like the perfect family. But something had changed in Sarah in the weeks leading up to the fire. Neighbors began to notice her behaving strangely. She would wander the streets at odd hours, muttering to herself under her breath. Her once bright eyes had grown hollow and distant, as if she were no longer fully present. She stopped taking Lily for walks, and the curtains of the Miller house remained drawn at all times. When neighbors asked if everything was all right, Sarah would force a smile and assure them she was fine. But no one believed her. The fire department arrived just in time to save Sarah and Lily from the blaze. The house was engulfed in flames, the heat so intense that it could be felt from across the street. Firefighters burst through the front door to find Sarah standing in the middle of the living room, her arms outstretched as if welcoming the inferno. She was holding Lily in one arm, the baby wrapped tightly in a blanket. Sarah's face was eerily calm, her eyes glazed over as she stared into the flames. She didn't struggle or scream as the firefighters pulled her and the baby to safety. She simply whispered something under her breath, a phrase that sent chills down the spines of everyone who heard it. She told me to do it. The words were barely audible, but they were enough to make the firefighters exchange uneasy glances. Sarah was rushed to the hospital, where she was treated for minor burns and smoke inhalation. Lily, miraculously, was unharmed. Mark, who had been at work during the fire, arrived at the hospital in a panic. He was relieved to find his daughter safe, but his relief turned to horror when he saw the state of his wife. Sarah was no longer the woman he had married. Her eyes were wild and unfocused, her voice trembling as she repeated the same phrase over and over again. She told me to do it. When doctors asked her who she was talking about, Sarah's face twisted into a grotesque smile. "The woman in the mirror," she said. "She's been watching me. She's been waiting." Mark didn't know what to do. He tried to comfort his wife, but she recoiled from his touch, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hatred. The doctors diagnosed her with severe psychosis and recommended she be committed to a psychiatric facility. Mark, devastated but desperate to protect his daughter, agreed. He packed up what little remained of their lives and moved out of state with Lily, leaving Sarah behind. But the story didn't end there. The house on Willow Lane was left a charred shell, its blackened walls and broken windows a stark reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded there. The neighborhood tried to move on, but an air of unease lingered. People began to talk, their whispers growing louder with each passing day. They said Sarah had been possessed, that something dark and malevolent had taken hold of her. They spoke of strange occurrences in the days leading up to the fire. Lights flickering in the Miller house, faint whispers heard through the walls, and the sound of footsteps in empty rooms. One neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, claimed she had seen a figure standing in the Miller's window late one night, a woman with long, dark hair and a pale, gaunt face. But when she looked again, the figure was gone. Another neighbor, Mr. Thompson, swore he had heard Sarah arguing with someone in the days before the fire, though no one else had been in the house. The rumors only grew after Sarah was committed. The staff at the psychiatric facility reported strange behavior from her. She would spend hours staring at the wall, her lips moving as if in conversation with someone only she could see. At night, she would scream in her sleep, her voice echoing through the halls. When questioned, she would only say one thing: "She's still here." Months passed, and the neighborhood slowly began to heal. The charred remains of the Miller house were torn down, and a new family moved in, eager to start fresh. But it wasn't long before they, too, began to experience strange occurrences. The wife, a practical woman named Emily, dismissed the stories as mere superstition, until the night she saw the woman in the mirror. It was late, and Emily was alone in the bathroom, brushing her teeth before bed. She glanced up at the mirror and froze. Reflected in the glass was not her own face, but that of a woman with long, dark hair and hollow, sunken eyes. The woman's lips curled into a sinister smile, and she raised a hand pointing directly at Emily. Emily screamed and stumbled backward, knocking over a bottle of shampoo. When she looked again, the reflection was her own. She told her husband what she had seen, but he brushed it off as a trick of the light. Emily tried to convince herself it was nothing, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She began to hear whispers in the night, faint and indistinct, but undeniably there. She found herself avoiding the mirrors in the house, unable to shake the memory of the woman's face. One night, as she lay in bed, she heard a voice, a soft, insidious whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She told me to do it. Emily sat bolt upright, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned to wake her husband, but he was already sitting up, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" he asked. Before Emily could respond, the sound of breaking glass echoed through the house. They rushed downstairs to find the living room mirror shattered, shards of glass scattered across the floor. Written in the dust on the wall above the mirror were 3 words: "I'm still here." The new family moved out less than a week later, leaving the house on Willow Lane empty once again. The neighbors avoided it, crossing the street to steer clear of its ominous presence. The house remained unsold, its windows dark and its yard overgrown. As for Sarah, she remains in the psychiatric facility, her condition unchanged. She spends her days staring at the wall, her lips moving in silent conversation. When asked who she's talking to, she simply smiles and says, "The woman in the mirror." I never believed in ghosts. Not really. Sure, I'd heard the stories, everyone has, but I always figured they were just that, stories. Tall tales told to scare kids or explain things people couldn't understand. That was before we moved into the house at 1841 Grace Street, before the walls started crying, before the screaming began. It was 1994, and my wife Sarah and I were desperate. We'd been living in a cramped apartment with our 6-year-old daughter, Clara, and the walls were closing in on us. I'd lost my job at the factory, and Sarah's part-time work at the library wasn't enough to keep us afloat. When we saw the listing for the house at 1841 Grace Street, it seemed like a miracle. A sprawling Victorian home with a wide porch and a big backyard, all for a price that was too good to be true. We should have known better. The real estate agent, a thin woman with a pinched face and a too bright smile, met us at the house on a gray, drizzly afternoon. She avoided our questions about the previous owners, brushing them off with vague answers. "It's been vacant for a while," she said, her voice tight, "but it just needs a little love." The house did need love. The paint was peeling, the floors creaked, and the air smelled faintly of mildew, but it was big, and it was ours, or so we thought. The first night we were too exhausted to notice anything strange. We unpacked what little we had, ate a quick dinner, and collapsed into bed. Clara, thrilled to have her own room for the first time, didn't even protest when we tucked her in and closed the door. It was around midnight when I first heard it. I was half asleep, drifting in that hazy space between dreams and wakefulness, when a low, guttural moan echoed through the house. Sarah sat up, her hand gripping my arm. "Jack," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Did you hear that?" I groaned, rolling over. "Hear what? It's just the house settling. Go back to sleep." But she didn't. The sound came again, louder this time, followed by something else, a faint, high-pitched cry, like a child sobbing. My stomach twisted. "Clara." Sarah threw off the covers and hurried down the hall to Clara's room. I followed, my heart pounding. Clara was sitting up in bed, her stuffed bear clutched tightly to her chest. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The walls are crying." I tried to calm her, telling her it was just the wind or the old pipes, but the look in her eyes told me she didn't believe me. And honestly, neither did I. The next few days were a blur of unpacking and settling in, but the noises never stopped. Every night, the moans and cries returned, growing louder, more insistent. Clara refused to sleep alone, so we set up a cot in our bedroom. She would lie awake, her wide eyes fixed on the ceiling, whispering, "The house is sad, Daddy," and angry. Then the screaming started. It happened at exactly 3:13 a.m. A blood-curdling, inhuman wail tore through the house, shaking the walls and rattling the windows. I bolted upright, my heart racing. Clara screamed, burying her face in Sarah's chest. I jumped out of bed, my face pale. "What the hell was that?" We searched the house, turning on every light, checking every room. But there was nothing. No intruders, no alarms, no explanation. The neighbors heard it too. By morning, the street was buzzing with speculation. Some thought it was a malfunctioning alarm. Others whispered about the house's dark history. Desperate for answers, Sarah began digging into the house's past. She spent hours at the local library, scouring old newspapers and property records. What she found made my blood run cold. In the 1950s, the house at 1841 Grace Street had been the site of a horrific tragedy. A family of 4 had lived there, a mother, father, and 2 children. The father, a deeply troubled man, had murdered his wife and son in a fit of rage before turning the knife on himself. The daughter, a 6-year-old girl named Emily, had vanished without a trace. Her body was never found. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Emily was still there, trapped within the walls of the house. That night, she shared her findings with me. I scoffed at first, but when the screaming started again at 3:13 a.m., even I couldn't deny that something was terribly wrong. The final straw came when Clara began sleepwalking. We found her standing in the hallway, her small hand pressed against the peeling wallpaper. "She's in there," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. "Emily's in there." Sarah and I decided we had to leave. We packed our bags in a frenzy, determined to spend the night in a hotel and never return. But as we carried our suitcases to the car, the front door slammed shut behind us. The house seemed to groan, the walls trembling as if in protest. And then, the screaming began, louder, more desperate than ever. The neighbors called the police again, but by the time they arrived, the house was silent. We were gone. Our car was still in the driveway, our suitcases abandoned on the porch. No one ever saw us again. To this day, the house at 1841 Grace Street remains empty. The windows are dark, the porch sagging under the weight of time. But every night, at exactly 3:13 a.m., the screaming echoes through the quiet suburban neighborhood. And if you listen closely, you might hear the faint sound of a child crying, trapped within the walls of the house that screamed. I don't know what happened to Sarah and Clara. I don't know if they're still in the house, or if they've become part of it. All I know is that I'm still here, trapped within these walls, screaming for someone to hear me. Please, if you ever find yourself on Grace Street, don't stop. Don't look at the house. And whatever you do, don't go inside, because once you do, you might never leave.